Sometimes the people who mock you the loudest are the ones who understand you the least. Ethan Miller spent his whole life being the family joke, the brother who saw value in what others called trash. When he bought a rotting wagon for $1 at an estate sale, his wealthy brothers laughed until they hurt. They called it firewood. But while prying up the rotted driver's bench in his barn, his crowbar struck something that changed everything. Hidden beneath a false bottom was a lead-lined box, untouched for 30 years. Inside lay the legendary Union Pacific Payroll from 1,869 uncut currency and gold bonds worth a fortune. What would happen when $1 turned their laughter into stunned silence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The high Wyoming country had a way of showing a man what he was made of. Cold winters that could freeze the mercy right out of your bones, hot summers when the grass turned brittle as old paper, and in between, those rare, perfect days when the sky stretched forever and you remembered why your grandfather's grandfather had staked his claim here in the first place. Ethan Miller stood in the doorway of his barn workshop, coffee mug warming his calloused hands, watching dawn paint the medicine bow peaks pink and gold. He was 45 years old, though his weathered face and the silver threading through his dark hair suggested a man who'd lived every one of those years honestly. His hands told stories, 2 scarred knuckles, a crooked pinky finger that had healed wrong after a horse kick 20 years back, fingernails perpetually rimmed with the honest dirt of work that couldn't be scrubbed away. Behind him, the barn held what his brothers called his collection of junk. Ethan preferred to think of it as a museum of second chances. An 1,890 oak icebox he'd rescued from a demolition site, its brass fittings polished until they caught the light just so. A Victorian parlour stove with elaborate scrollwork that he'd found rusting in a creek bed, now restored and waiting for the right buyer who'd appreciate the craftsmanship of another era. Wooden wagon wheels leaning against the wall, some he'd re-spoked himself during long winter evenings. Mason jars full of square nails, hand-forged hinges, glass doorknobs in colours they didn't make anymore. To Jack and Cole, his older brothers, it was all trash. To Ethan, every piece whispered a story about the hands that had made it, the family that had used it, the years it had survived. He'd developed an eye for these things, a sense for what others overlooked. It had started when he was maybe 8 or 9, finding an old tin lunch pail in the hayloft, imagining the ranch hand who'd carried his supper in it, the dents and scratches evidence of a working life. His father had caught him polishing it with his shirt tail. "That's just old junk, boy," his father had said, not unkindly, but with the same tone you'd use to correct a child who'd brought home a stray cat that couldn't be kept. Focus on what matters. This ranch, these cattle, building something that lasts. But Ethan had kept the lunch pail anyway, hidden it in his room. Started finding other things. A chipped pitcher, a rusted spade with a worn wooden handle shaped perfectly to someone's grip. Each one a small rebellion against the idea that only new things, expensive things, shiny things had worth. The Miller Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in the state. Ethan's great-grandfather had built the original homestead in 1882, and 4 generations had added to it since. The main house stood proud on a rise overlooking the valley, 2 stories of whitewashed timber and river stone, with a wraparound porch and green shutters. His father had added the west wing in the 80s, put in central heat, modernized the kitchen. When he'd died 5 years ago of a heart attack while fixing fence line, he'd left the whole operation to Jack, the eldest son. Cole got the equipment and half the herd. Ethan got a small monthly stipend and permission to stay in the foreman's cottage at the edge of the property. Nobody had been surprised by the arrangement. Jack was the natural inheritor, serious, business-minded, already running the operation by the time their father's health started failing. Cole had the charm, the connections, served on the Cattlemen's Association board. Ethan was the odd one, the one who'd rather tinker in a barn than ride fence, who read books about frontier history instead of commodities reports, who saw poetry in rust. The cottage suited him fine. 2 rooms, a wood stove, a covered porch where he could sit evenings and watch the light change on the mountains. Simple, quiet, his. The barn was 50 yards off, big enough for his workshop, and still leave room for the battered 1,979 Ford pickup he kept running through sheer stubbornness and a knack for coaxing life from tired engines. He finished his coffee and set the mug on the workbench, running his hand over a project he'd been working on for weeks, a child's rocking horse from the 1,920 seconds. The original dappled paint, mostly gone, one rocker cracked clean through. He'd steamed and clamped the wood, fitted a splice that would hold another 100 years if treated right. Later today he'd start on the repainting, matching the faded pattern he could still see in the protected curves. Somebody's grandmother had probably ridden this horse. Now somebody's granddaughter would ride it again. That continuity meant something to Ethan, even if he couldn't explain it in words his brothers would understand. Sunday dinners at the main house were tradition, and tradition mattered in the Miller family, even when it chafed like new boots. Ethan drove up the gravel lane at noon, parking his dusty Ford beside Jack's new Silverado and Cole's Lexus SUV. The contrast always made him smile a little. 2 vehicles that cost more than most people made in 3 years, and his truck that had rolled over 300,000 miles and was still game for another 300,000 if asked. Jack's wife, Linda, answered the door with her practiced hostess smile. She'd never been unkind to Ethan, just distant, as if she wasn't quite sure what to make of a brother-in-law who wore flannel shirts with the elbows worn through and didn't care about the things normal people cared about. "Ethan, good to see you." Everyone's in the dining room. The table was set for 6, Jack and Linda, Cole and his girlfriend Melissa, and the 2 end chairs for Ethan and the empty seat where their father used to sit. Nobody sat in that chair now. It just stayed empty, a ghost at every meal. "Look who finally showed up," Cole said, grinning as Ethan took his usual seat. "Thought maybe you'd found some rusty treasure and forgot the time." Ethan smiled mildly. Cole's teasing had more affection in it than malice, usually. "Just finishing up a project. That rocking horse I mentioned." "Still playing with toys," Jack said, but he was already focused on carving the roast, his tone more absent than cutting. Jack didn't have time for mockery. He barely had time for conversation that didn't involve cattle prices or land management. The meal proceeded as these meals always did. Linda talked about the church fundraiser. Melissa mentioned a spa weekend in Jackson Hole. Cole discussed a deal he was working on, buying out a smaller ranch to the north. Jack half listened to all of it while calculating something in his head, probably feed costs or the timing of moving the herd to summer pasture. Ethan ate quietly, answered when spoken to, and thought about the auction he'd heard about for next Saturday. The Larson estate, 40 miles north. Old Dutch Larson had died at 93, no family, his whole property going on the block. Ethan had driven past that place dozens of times over the years. Dutch had been a railroad man before he retired, kept to himself, let his land go to seed. Supposedly there were outbuildings full of who knows what, decades of accumulation. "You're quiet today," Linda said, passing him the potatoes. "Everything all right?" "Fine," Ethan said. "Just thinking." "Dangerous occupation for you," Cole said, winking. "Last time you thought too hard, you bought that barn full of junk." "That barn full of junk has paid for itself 3 times over," Ethan said evenly. "Sold a restored dresser last month for $800, paid $40 for it at an estate sale." $800, Jack said, looking up from his plate. "Ethan, I spend more than that on worming medication. You're 45 years old and playing antiques dealer like it's a real profession." "It is a real profession," Ethan said quietly. "Just a different one than what you're used to." "Different," Jack repeated, setting down his fork. "That's one word for it. Wasting your potential is another. Dad left you part of this ranch, Ethan. You could be helping build something that matters instead of tinkering with broken furniture. This was familiar territory. Ethan had learned long ago that defending himself only prolonged the conversation. I appreciate the concern, Jack, but I'm content with what I'm doing. Content, Jack said, as if the word tasted wrong. You know what Dad used to say about being content, that it was just another word for giving up. Ethan didn't reply. His father had said a lot of things, most of them measuring people against standards they'd never agreed to in the first place. He'd loved his father, respected him even, but they'd never understood each other. Robert Miller had been a practical man who believed in tangible results, headcounts and acreage, profit margins and property values. Ethan's interest in preserving old things, in finding beauty in what others discarded, had always struck his father as a kind of foolishness, like trying to hold on to water with your bare hands. After dinner, Ethan helped Linda clear the table while his brothers stepped out to the porch to smoke cigars and discuss matters they considered important. Through the window he could see them, Jack gesturing at the valley spread below, Cole nodding and laughing at something. They looked like what they were, successful men, confident in their place in the world, certain that the way they measured worth was the only way that mattered. Ethan washed the serving dishes by hand, carefully, the way his mother had taught him before she died when he was 12. Linda worked beside him, drying and putting away, and after a while she said, "They don't mean to be hard on you, you know." "I know. Do you?" She set down the towel, looked at him with something like sympathy. "Sometimes I think you're the happiest one of all of us, Ethan. You do what you love. That's more than most people can say." He smiled at her, genuinely grateful for the kindness. "Thanks, Linda. That means something. Jack worries about you, in his own way. I know that too. He just wants you to have security, a real future." "I have both those things," Ethan said, handing her the last platter. "They just don't look like what he thinks they should look like." Driving home as the sun angled low across the valley, Ethan felt the familiar weight of Sunday dinners settling in his chest. Not quite sadness, not quite frustration, just a kind of weariness that came from being misunderstood by people you loved who would never quite see you the way you actually were. He pulled into his usual spot by the cottage and sat for a moment with the engine ticking cool. In the glove compartment lay his father's pocket watch, silver, tarnished now despite Ethan's periodic attempts to clean it. The inscription on the back read, "To Robert Miller, for 25 years faithful service, Union Pacific Railroad, 1955. His grandfather's watch, passed to his father, meant to go to the eldest son, but Jack hadn't wanted it after the funeral. "Keep it," he'd said, pressing it into Ethan's hand. "You're the one who cares about old things." There'd been dismissal in his voice, but also something else. Permission, maybe. Or surrender to the idea that Ethan was never going to be the kind of son their father had hoped for. Ethan turned the watch over in his hands now, felt the weight of it, the smoothness worn into the case by decades of his grandfather's thumb checking the time, then his father's. The watch didn't run anymore. He'd never tried to fix it, preferred to keep it exactly as it was the last time his father had held it. Some things weren't meant to be restored, just remembered. The workshop light was fading by the time Ethan made his way to the barn, but he knew every inch of that space by feel as much as sight. He lit the old kerosene lantern he kept on the workbench. Electricity was fine for power tools, but there was something about lantern light that seemed right for this kind of work, and picked up the rocking horse he'd been restoring. The repair was solid. The wood had accepted the splice perfectly, and when he tested the rockers, they moved smooth and true. Tomorrow he'd start the delicate work of matching the paint, recreating the dappled pattern some craftsman had applied nearly a century ago. It would take patience, a steady hand, an eye for detail, the kind of work his brothers would never have the temperament for, even if they could see the value in it, which they couldn't, and that was all right. Ethan had made peace with being the odd one, the brother who didn't fit, the son who disappointed. You couldn't spend your whole life trying to be what other people thought you should be. Eventually you had to decide what kind of man you wanted to be, and then go ahead and be that, regardless of whether anyone else understood or approved. He ran his hand along the horse's mane, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his palm. Somewhere, probably long dead now, was the person who'd carved this. Someone who'd taken care with the details, who'd wanted to make something beautiful and lasting for a child they'd loved. The work had outlived them, the care had outlived them, and now Ethan was here, decades later, making sure their work survived another generation. That meant something. It had to mean something. Outside, the last light was leaving the sky, stars beginning to show in the deepening blue. Ethan extinguished the lantern and stood in the darkness of his barn, surrounded by the silent testimony of lives lived and lost, by tools and treasures that had outlasted their makers, by the patient accumulation of small acts of preservation that nobody but him seemed to think mattered. His brothers had their ranch, their cattle, their quarterly profits and expansion plans. They had the legacy their father had built and the future they were building on top of it. Good for them. Honest work, important work. But Ethan had these quiet hours in a barn full of rescued things, the satisfaction of giving forgotten objects a second chance, the knowledge that he was keeping faith with the hands that had made them. It wasn't the life anyone had expected him to live, but it was the life that fit him like old boots, comfortable and true. Sometimes the best treasures were the ones nobody else thought to look for, and sometimes the richest inheritance wasn't land or money, but the freedom to discover what you valued on your own terms. Ethan locked the barn door and walked back to his cottage beneath a sky, now fully dark and brilliant with stars. Tomorrow he'd work on the rocking horse. Next Saturday, he'd drive up to the Larson auction, see what kind of forgotten things might be waiting there for someone who knew how to look. Life was good, even when your family didn't understand it. Maybe especially then. The Larson estate sat at the end of a gravel road that hadn't seen maintenance in 20 years. Ethan pulled up on Saturday morning to find trucks and cars already lining both sides of the lane, people milling around with coffee cups and auction paddles, sizing up what old Dutch Larson had left behind. The property sprawled across 40 acres of scrubland and timothy grass gone wild. The house itself was a sagging two-story structure with broken windows and a porch that looked ready to give up and fall into the foundation. But it wasn't the house that interested the crowd. It was the outbuildings, 3 barns, 2 sheds, and various lean-tos, filled with the accumulation of a man who'd lived 93 years and apparently never thrown anything away. Ethan registered with the auctioneer's assistant, got his paddle number 47, and started walking the property like he always did, taking mental inventory before the bidding started. There were the usual suspects: farming implements, hand tools by the hundreds, furniture in various states of decay. Some decent pieces if you knew what you were looking at. A brass bed frame that would clean up nice, an oak dining table with good bones beneath the dust and mouse droppings. He was making his way toward the far field when he saw it. The wagon sat maybe 200 yards from the nearest barn, half hidden in tall grass that had grown up around and through it. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than collapsed wood and rust, something that had been sitting there so long the land was starting to reclaim it. But Ethan's eye caught the lines of it, the shape beneath the rot, and he felt that familiar pull in his chest that said, here was something worth a closer look. He pushed through the grass to reach it. A Conestoga wagon, or what was left of one. The canvas cover was long gone. 3 of the 4 wheels had rotted off or been scavenged, leaving the wagon box tilted at an angle, like a ship going down. The wood was grey with age and weathering, split in places, warped in others. Most people would see firewood, if they noticed it at all. But Ethan saw the iron bands that had held it together, the heavy bolts, the craftsmanship of the frame. This wagon was old, really old. Judging by the construction, he'd guess 1,860 seconds, maybe 1,870 seconds. built to cross the continent, to carry families west through weather and hardship that would kill you if you weren't careful. Every inch of it had been made to last by someone who understood that lives would depend on this wagon, holding together mile after brutal mile. He climbed up carefully, testing his weight on wood that protested but held. The driver's bench was still there, or most of it. The seat itself had rotted through, but the bench frame remained, bolted to the wagon box with rusted iron fittings. He ran his hand along the wood, feeling the grain, the age, the silent testimony of whoever had driven this wagon, God knows how many miles before abandoning it here to weather and time. Find something interesting? Ethan turned to see a man in his 60s approaching through the grass, wearing auction company coveralls and carrying a clipboard. Just looking, Ethan said. This part of the sale? Everything's part of the sale. Old Dutch had that wagon sitting here since I was a kid. My daddy used to tell me it had been here since before he was born. Guess Dutch got it with the property when he bought the place back in the 50s. The man peered at the wagon with the skeptical eye of someone whose job was assigning value to things. Not much left to it. Probably list it for scrap value if anyone's interested. Any story to it? How it got here? The man shrugged. Dutch never talked much about anything. Far as I know, it just came with the land. Been sitting here rotting ever since. After the man walked off to inventory something else, Ethan spent another few minutes examining the wagon. The more he looked, the more details emerged. Hand-forged nails in the boards, mortise and tenon joints cut by someone who knew their trade. This wasn't some rush job thrown together by amateurs. This was real craftsmanship from an era when making something meant making it right because there wasn't going to be a second chance. He had no idea what he'd do with it. The wagon was far too deteriorated to restore, really. But those iron bands alone might be worth something, and there was probably good hardwood buried under the rot if you knew where to look. At the very least, it would be interesting to study, to understand how they'd built these things to survive the Oregon Trail or the journey to California goldfields. The auction started at 10 o'clock sharp. Ethan bid successfully on a few small items, a box of hand tools, some mason jars, a wooden pulley system that had probably come from a barn loft. Reasonable prices, nothing that would break his budget. Around him, serious bidders competed for the valuable pieces. A bedroom set went for $4,000, a restored tractor for $12,000. The wagon wasn't listed until nearly 3 hours in, after most of the valuable items had been sold and half the crowd had drifted away. The auctioneer's voice had gone hoarse from calling bids. Lot 73, he announced, consulting his notes. Conestoga wagon, as is, where is, out in the back field, buyer responsible for removal. Do I hear $50? Silence. People looked at each other. Some smiled, but nobody raised a paddle. You couldn't even see the wagon from where the auction was being held. Most of the remaining crowd probably had no idea what he was talking about. How about 25? The auctioneer tried. More silence. Someone in the back laughed. Come on, folks, it's got to be worth something. Iron alone's worth scrap value. Do I hear $10? Ethan raised his paddle. The auctioneer looked relieved. Thank you, sir. I have $10. Do I hear 15? Nobody moved. $10 going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. $1, Ethan called out. The auctioneer blinked. I'm sorry, sir. I bid $1 instead. If nobody else wants it, that seems like fair value for scrap wood. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. The auctioneer smiled despite himself. You already bid 10, sir. Are you reducing your own bid? I am. More laughter. Someone called out, Let him have it for $1, Tom. Nobody else is buying firewood today. The auctioneer shrugged. Fair enough. I have $1. Anyone else? No? Sold to paddle 47 for $1. Son, you just bought yourself the most expensive kindling in Wyoming. Ethan paid his $1 at the cashier's table, collected his receipt, and was heading back to examine his purchase more carefully when he heard a familiar voice behind him. You have got to be kidding me. He turned to find Cole standing there, grinning like he'd just witnessed something too absurd not to share. Behind him, Jack was climbing out of the Silverado they'd apparently just pulled up in. "Hey, Cole," Ethan said. "Didn't know you were coming out here. We weren't planning to. Drove past and saw the crowd. Thought we'd see if there was anything worth picking up." Cole was still grinning. "Did you seriously just buy that collapsed wagon out there for $1? "I did." "Why?" "Iron bands might be worth something, and I'm curious about the construction." Jack walked over, hands in his pockets, looking at Ethan with that expression he got when dealing with something he couldn't quite believe but had long since given up being surprised by. "Please tell me you didn't actually bid money on that pile of rot." $1, Ethan said. Seemed reasonable. "Reasonable," Jack repeated. He looked at Cole, then back at Ethan, then shook his head slowly. "You just spent money on firewood, Ethan. That's all that is. Expensive firewood. It's $1, Jack. I think I'll survive the financial hit." "It's not about the dollar," Jack said, and there was something almost sad in his voice now. "It's about what it represents. You're 45 years old, and you're still making decisions like this. Buying junk nobody else wants because you think you see something they don't." "Maybe I do see something they don't," Ethan said quietly. "Or maybe," Jack said, "you just can't admit that sometimes trash is just trash." Cole was still grinning, clearly enjoying this. "Wait until I tell Linda about this. My brother, the guy who paid actual money for a wagon that doesn't even have wheels anymore." "Tell whoever you want," Ethan said. "I've got to figure out how to get it back to my place." As his brothers walked off toward the remaining auction items, Ethan heard Cole's laughter drifting back. Not mean-spirited exactly. Just the kind of laughter that came from watching someone do something so ridiculous you couldn't help but be entertained by it. Ethan stood there for a moment, his dollar receipt in his hand, looking across the field at the wagon tilted in its bed of grass. Maybe they were right. Maybe he had just bought the world's most expensive firewood. Maybe he was a 45-year-old man making foolish decisions about things that didn't matter to anyone but him. But as he walked back across that field toward his purchase, he felt that same quiet satisfaction he always felt when he rescued something everyone else had written off. The wagon had been sitting here for decades, ignored, forgotten, slowly dissolving back into the earth. And now, someone had noticed it. Someone had said it was worth something, even if that something was only $1. Sometimes that's all it took. Someone willing to look at what everyone else overlooked. He'd figure out how to haul it home. He'd take his time examining it properly, seeing what could be salvaged and what was truly lost. And if his brothers wanted to laugh, let them laugh. He'd been the family joke this long. One more dollar's worth of ridicule wouldn't kill him. Getting the wagon home turned out to be more complicated than Ethan had anticipated. The thing weighed considerably more than it looked like it should, even without wheels and with half the wood rotted through. He ended up borrowing a flatbed trailer from a neighbor and spending the better part of Sunday afternoon rigging a system of chains and come-alongs to winch the wagon bed up onto the trailer without having the whole thing collapse into pieces. By the time he got it back to his property and maneuvered the trailer into his barn, the sun was setting, and his back was reminding him that he wasn't 20 years old anymore. He left the wagon on the trailer for the night, too tired to do more than cover it with a tarp against the dust and make his way to the cottage for supper and sleep. Monday morning, he was back in the barn with fresh coffee and a clear head, ready to start the real examination. He pulled the tarp off and stood there for a few minutes, just looking. In the better light of the barn, with electric bulbs instead of prairie sun, the wagon looked even more deteriorated than he'd remembered. The wood was split and warped in a dozen places. The iron bands were crusted with rust, thick enough that you could barely see the metal beneath. The bolts holding the frame together were frozen solid with corrosion. Still, there was something about it, the shape of the thing, the way it had been built. Whoever had constructed this wagon had known what they were doing. The joints, where you could still see them beneath the rot, showed real skill. The iron fittings, despite the rust, were heavy-duty and well-forged. This had been made to last. Made by someone who understood that crossing the frontier wasn't a Sunday drive, but a test of equipment and will that could kill you if either one failed. He started with the simple work first, brushing away loose dirt and debris with a soft bristle brush, trying to get a sense of what he was dealing with. Dust rose in clouds that made him grateful for the dust mask he'd learned to wear years ago. Beneath the surface, dirt was more dirt, and beneath that, the grey wood that had been weathering here since before he was born. The driver's bench fascinated him most. The seatboards had rotted through completely, but the bench frame itself was still solid in places. He tested the wood carefully, probing with an awl to see where it was sound and where rot had eaten through. The bench had been built with a storage compartment underneath, a common feature in these old wagons, a place to keep tools or valuables where they'd be close at hand during the journey. The compartment was filled with dirt and what looked like the remains of old sacking, so deteriorated that it disintegrated when he touched it. He scooped out the debris carefully, dumping it into a bucket, more out of thoroughness than any real expectation of finding something interesting. Probably mice had nested in there for decades. Probably there was nothing but rot and waste. His fingers hit something solid beneath the dirt. Ethan paused, then dug more carefully. Not solid wood, this was different. Metal, maybe? He brushed away more dirt, feeling the shape of it, flat, rectangular. Definitely metal, though covered with so much corrosion and packed dirt that he couldn't tell much more than that. He worked patiently, clearing the debris around whatever it was, until he could see that it was bolted to the bottom of the storage compartment. Not just set there, but actually fastened down, like someone had wanted to make sure it didn't move during travel. The bolts were the same heavy iron as the rest of the wagon's fittings, rusted solid now, but you could still see they'd been installed deliberately. Interesting. Ethan sat back on his heels, studying what he could see. A metal box of some kind, maybe a foot wide and 18 inches long, bolted into a false bottom beneath the driver's bench. Why would someone do that? The obvious answer was to hide something valuable, keep it secure during a long journey. But what and why leave it here? He was still considering that question when he heard a truck pull up outside. A moment later, Cole's voice called out, "Ethan, you in here?" In the barn. Cole came in, thumbs hooked in his belt, that perpetual almost smile on his face. "Couldn't resist checking on your big purchase. You actually got that heap of junk home, I see." "I did. What did it cost you, besides the dollar, I mean? Trailer rental? Gas? Your entire back?" "Nothing I can't handle," Ethan said, standing and brushing dirt off his jeans. Cole walked around the wagon, shaking his head. "I still can't believe you bid on this. Even for you, this is excessive. There's literally nothing here worth saving. The iron might be salvageable." "The iron," Cole said, "is rust. That's all it is now. Rust shaped like iron used to be." He kicked gently at one of the wagon boards, and a chunk of rotted wood crumbled away. "See? Firewood. I told you." "Then why are you here?" Ethan asked mildly. "If it's just worthless junk, why drive over to look at it?" Cole grinned. "Because it's funny, Ethan. You're my brother and I love you, but you have to admit this is pretty funny. Spending actual money on something that should have been bulldozed decades ago. It's history. It's garbage. But hey, it's your garbage. Just do me a favor and don't mention this at Sunday dinner, all right? Jack's already worked up about you wasting time instead of helping with the ranch. If he finds out you're spending money on this stuff too, he's going to have an actual fit. Jack doesn't need to worry about my finances. He worries anyway. We both do." Cole's expression softened slightly. "Look, I know you think we don't get it. Maybe we don't. But we're family, and we want you to be okay. And spending money on rotted wagons doesn't really say okay to us." "I am okay, Cole. Better than okay." "If you say so." Cole gave the wagon one more dubious look. "Well, enjoy your project. Just promise me you'll charge admission when you turn this into the world's ugliest lawn ornament." After Cole left, Ethan stood in the barn for a long moment, listening to the truck drive away. His brother's words echoed in the space. Garbage, firewood, worthless junk. It wasn't the first time he'd heard those opinions about things he'd bought. Wouldn't be the last. But that box bolted under the driver's bench said something different. Someone had gone to deliberate effort to secure something in that wagon. Someone had thought whatever was in that box was worth protecting, worth hiding, worth the trouble of heavy bolts and a false bottom. Ethan looked at his workbench, at the tools hanging there. He had crowbars, bolt cutters, a hacksaw if it came to that. The bolts holding that box in place were rusted solid, but rust could be broken. Iron could be cut. He could get that box out, see what someone had thought was worth securing 150 years ago. Tomorrow, he decided. Tonight he was tired, and the wagon wasn't going anywhere. Tomorrow he'd come back fresh, with proper tools and good light, and he'd see what old Dutch Larson's wagon had been hiding all these years. But standing there in the quiet barn, with dust motes drifting through the air and the smell of old wood and rust all around him, Ethan felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Anticipation. For the first time since he'd bought the wagon, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he hadn't bought firewood after all. Maybe his dollar had been the best investment he'd ever made. Tomorrow would tell the story. Tomorrow he'd find out what was in that box. And something in his gut, some instinct built from years of seeing value where others saw trash, told him that whatever it wasn't nothing. Tuesday morning came cold and clear. Frost on the grass outside the cottage, making everything look like it had been dipped in sugar. Ethan made his coffee and carried it to the barn, his breath steaming in the crisp air. The anticipation from yesterday had settled into a calm determination. Whatever was in that box, he'd find out today. He'd gathered his tools last night before turning in a heavy pry bar, a set of wrenches, penetrating oil, a small sledgehammer. The bolts holding the box in place were the challenge. They'd been there for decades, maybe over a century, frozen by rust and time into something closer to welded joints than mechanical fasteners. He started by soaking the bolts with penetrating oil, then went to work on the rocking horse while the oil did its job. Patience was the key to this kind of work. Rush it, and you'd strip a bolt head or crack the wood. Take your time and let chemistry and physics do the heavy lifting. An hour later, he returned to the wagon with his tools. The first bolt fought him hard, the wrench slipping twice before he got a good grip. He applied steady pressure, feeling for that moment when rust gives up its hold. There, a small crack, almost inaudible, and the bolt turned a quarter-inch, then another quarter-inch. After that it came easier, threading out slowly but steadily. The second bolt was more stubborn. No amount of penetrating oil seemed to help. Finally, Ethan resorted to the pry bar, using it as a lever to apply torque. The wrench alone couldn't manage. The bolt head twisted, groaned, and suddenly snapped clean off. He sat back, considering. One bolt out, one broken, 4 more to go. The broken bolt meant the box might be permanently attached on that corner, but that was all right. He could work around it. By noon, he had 4 bolts out and 2 broken. The box itself remained stuck, sealed by years of corrosion and accumulated grime. He worked the pry bar under one edge, applying gentle pressure, feeling for give. The metal creaked. He shifted to another edge, tried again, more creaking, and then suddenly the box lurched upward a quarter-inch. Progress. He worked systematically around all 4 edges, prying a little at a time until the box came free with a sound like ripping fabric. The bottom was crusted with rust and dirt, but the top was smoother, protected all these years by being pressed against the wagon frame. It was heavy, maybe 30 pounds. The metal was thick, either iron or steel, hard to tell beneath the corrosion. There was no obvious latch or opening mechanism that he could see. The whole thing appeared to be sealed, possibly lead-lined if his guess about the weight was right. He carried it to his workbench and set it under a strong light. Now that he could examine it properly, he saw there was a seam around the top, almost invisible beneath the rust. A lid, then. The lid appeared to have been soldered shut at some point, which explained why there was no latch. Someone hadn't just wanted to secure this box, they'd wanted to seal it permanently. Ethan cleaned the surface carefully with a wire brush, removing the worst of the corrosion. Beneath the rust, letters emerged, stamped into the metal. He brushed more carefully, tracing them out. UPRR. Union Pacific Railroad. He sat back, staring at those letters. The same railroad his grandfather had worked for, the one that had given his father that pocket watch. The railroad that had helped build the West, connecting coast to coast with iron and ambition and the sweat of thousands of workers. This box had belonged to the railroad, or been stolen from it more likely, given that it had been hidden in a wagon and sealed shut. People didn't seal legitimate cargo. Ethan's hands were suddenly less steady than they'd been a moment ago. He'd found interesting things before: antique tools, forgotten photographs, letters that told small stories about ordinary lives. But this felt different. This felt significant in a way he couldn't quite name yet. He needed to think about this carefully. Opening the box would require cutting through the seal, probably damaging whatever was inside if he wasn't careful. And if this really was stolen railroad property, there might be legal implications, or historical value that shouldn't be damaged by amateur excavation. His first instinct was to call someone, but who? The sheriff? A museum? His brothers? That last thought brought a wry smile. He could imagine Cole's reaction. "You found a rusty box in your rusty wagon? Congratulations, Ethan. That's almost as useful as the wagon itself." No, before he did anything else, he needed to know what he was dealing with. He needed information. Sarah would know. Sarah Hendricks, the librarian in town. She'd helped him research antiques before, track down histories of old ranches and families. She had access to historical records, archives, newspapers going back 100 years. If anyone could help him figure out what this box was and whether it mattered, Sarah could. He covered the box with a clean cloth and locked the barn. 20 minutes later, he was parking in front of the county library, a modest brick building that served the whole valley. Sarah was at the reference desk, as she usually was, her reading glasses perched on her nose while she helped a young mother find children's books. She looked up as Ethan approached and smiled. "Ethan Miller. I was wondering when you'd show up. It's been almost 2 weeks." "I know. Been busy with projects. Find something good at the Larson auction? I heard you were there. Found something interesting anyway. That's actually why I'm here. I need some help with research." Sarah's eyes lit up. She loved research the way Ethan loved restoration for its own sake, for the satisfaction of uncovering what had been hidden or forgotten. What kind of research? Union Pacific Railroad. Specifically, anything about payroll shipments or missing cargo around 1869, 1870. Her eyebrows went up. "That's specific. What did you find?" "A box. Sealed. Stamped with Union Pacific markings, hidden in that wagon I bought." She studied him for a moment, then said, "Give me 20 minutes to finish up here, then let's see what we can dig up." 40 minutes later, they were in the library's back room, surrounded by boxes of old newspapers on microfilm and historical records Sarah had pulled from the archives. She'd started with newspaper accounts from the late 1862 and early 1872, searching for anything about railroad theft or missing shipments. "Here," she said, pointing to a screen showing the Cheyenne Daily Leader from October 1869. "Train robbery, 5 miles outside of Laramie. Says they got away with a payroll shipment bound for the railhead cruise." Ethan leaned in to read. The article was brief, typical of the era. A Union Pacific Payroll train had been stopped by armed men, the guards overpowered, and several strong boxes taken. Total loss estimated at $12,000 in currency and bonds. The thieves had escaped into the hills. No arrests had been made. $12,000, Sarah said. In 1869, that would be worth considerably more today. If the box I found is from that robbery, Ethan said slowly, "and if the money's still inside, we're talking about something that belongs to the railroad, or to history, not to me." Sarah looked at him steadily. "That's the right way to think about it. But first, you need to know what's actually in that box. Could be nothing. Could be old paperwork. Could be someone's lunch pail for all you know. It's heavy enough to be money. Gold bonds, currency, coins maybe. Only one way to find out," Sarah said. "But Ethan, if this is what you think it is, you need to be careful about how you handle this. There are laws about treasure trove, about historical artifacts. You can't just crack it open and pocket the contents. I wouldn't do that anyway. I know you wouldn't. I'm just saying, think this through. Maybe talk to someone who knows about these things before you do anything irreversible." Ethan nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. Somewhere in his barn, sitting on his workbench under a cloth, was possibly a piece of Wyoming history, a mystery that had waited over a century to be solved. And he, Ethan Miller, family joke and junk collector, had stumbled onto it for the price of $1. Life had a sense of humor sometimes, a strange one, but a sense of humor nonetheless. The days that followed had a strange quality to them, like Ethan was living in two timelines at once. On the surface, everything continued as normal. He worked on his restoration projects, ate his meals, attended Sunday dinner with his family. But underneath, his thoughts kept circling back to that sealed box in his barn, to the weight of it and the promise it represented. He didn't mention it to his brothers. What would be the point? If it turned out to be nothing, they'd just have one more thing to mock him about. And if it turned out to be something significant, well, they'd find out soon enough. Sarah had helped him identify 3 other documented railroad thefts from that era, all unsolved, all involving payroll shipments. The more they researched, the more convinced Ethan became that what he'd found was connected to one of those robberies. The question was, which one, and what had happened to the people who'd hidden it? He spent an evening examining the wagon more carefully, looking for anything else that might provide clues. In the remains of the wagon bed, he found rusted hinges from the storage compartment, a broken axle pin, some square nails scattered in the dirt. Nothing that told him anything new. On Thursday, Sarah called. "I found something you'll want to see. Can you come by the library?" He was there in 15 minutes. She had a newspaper spread out on the reference desk, this one from 1872. "Look at this obituary. Man named Thomas Garrett died in Casper. Says he was a former wagon driver, worked the freight routes before the railroad came through. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is this." She pointed to a line near the bottom. "It says he died of injuries from a shooting that happened 3 years prior, 1869. He'd been living as a recluse, hiding from what the paper calls past misdeeds." 3 years, Ethan said. "Same year as that train robbery we found." "Right. And get this, the obituary mentions he had worked for Union Pacific briefly before taking up freight hauling again. What if he was involved in the robbery? What if he hid the money in his wagon, planning to come back for it, but couldn't because he was shot during the escape? And the wagon ended up here because he abandoned it," Ethan continued. "Maybe sold it, maybe just left it when he ran, and it's been sitting here ever since, waiting." They looked at each other across the desk, the weight of possibility hanging between them. "This is starting to feel real," Sarah said quietly. "It is real. The question is, what do I do about it? You could open the box. I could. Or I could notify the authorities, let them handle it properly." "Which is the right thing to do," Sarah agreed, "but also the thing that means you'll probably never know what's inside. They'll take it, process it, file it away somewhere. You'll be a footnote in somebody's report." Ethan smiled at her perception. "You know me too well. I know you bought a rotting wagon for $1 because you saw something nobody else did. I know you've spent your whole life rescuing things other people threw away. And I know you're the most honest person I've ever met, which means you're going to do the right thing, even if it means giving this up." She wasn't wrong, but the temptation was there, stronger than he'd expected. just to open the box, to see what 150 years of secrecy had been protecting, to be the first person to lay eyes on whatever was inside since Thomas Garrett had sealed it away. That night, Ethan sat in his cottage with his father's pocket watch in his hand, turning it over and over, feeling the familiar weight of it. His grandfather had worked for Union Pacific for 25 years. Honest work, hard work. He'd earned that watch through loyalty and dedication, doing things the right way day after day. Would his grandfather want him to keep this box, this money that hadn't been honestly earned, or would he expect Ethan to do what was right, regardless of what it cost him? The answer wasn't even a question, really, but that didn't make the decision easier. Friday morning, he drove into town and stopped at the sheriff's office. Deputy Martinez was at the front desk, working on paperwork. "Morning, Ethan. What can I do for you?" "I need to talk to the sheriff about something I found." 20 minutes later, he was sitting in Sheriff Dawson's office, explaining about the wagon, the box, and what he and Sarah had discovered in their research. Dawson listened without interrupting, his weathered face neutral. He'd been sheriff for 20 years, had seen just about everything this county had to offer. When Ethan finished, Dawson sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "Let me make sure I understand," he said finally. "You bought a 150-year-old wagon for $1, found a sealed box hidden in it, researched enough to believe it's stolen railroad property from 1869, and now you're here voluntarily reporting it instead of just opening it and keeping whatever's inside." "That's right. Most people wouldn't do that, Ethan." "I'm not most people, I guess." Dawson smiled slightly. "No, you're not. All right, here's what we'll do. I'll contact the State Historical Society, see what they advise. This is likely beyond my jurisdiction, could be federal, could be state, might even still be technically Union Pacific property if there's any legal continuity. Going to take some time to sort out." "I understand. In the meantime, that box needs to stay secure. You comfortable keeping it at your place? Or would you rather I lock it up here?" Ethan thought about it. Part of him wanted to keep it close, to guard what he'd found. But another part knew that having it here, in official custody, would eliminate any question about his intentions or integrity. "You keep it," he said. "I trust you'll handle it properly." "I will. Bring it by whenever you're ready. And Ethan, I want you to know, this is the right thing you're doing. Not everyone would." Back at his barn, Ethan wrapped the box carefully in old blankets and loaded it into his truck. He sat there for a moment before starting the engine, one hand resting on the cloth-wrapped shape beside him. Whatever was inside, whatever story it held, would remain a mystery to him now. He'd found it, but it wasn't his to keep or even to open. That was all right. Some things mattered more than knowing. Some things mattered more than possession. He'd done what his grandfather would have expected, what his father, for all their differences, would have respected, what his own conscience demanded. As he drove back toward town with his mystery cargo beside him, Ethan felt lighter somehow, not disappointed, but relieved. He'd made the choice that let him sleep at night, that let him look at himself in the mirror without flinching. His brothers would never understand that. They'd probably call him a fool for giving up what might be a fortune. But they didn't have to understand. This wasn't about them. This was about the kind of man Ethan Miller had decided to be, $1 purchase at a time. Word got around, the way it always does in small towns. By the time Ethan showed up for Sunday dinner, his brothers had heard some version of the story, probably filtered through enough retellings that the truth was barely recognizable anymore. "So," Cole said as soon as Ethan walked in, "is it true you found buried treasure in that wagon?" Ethan set down the dish he'd brought. Linda had asked him to pick up rolls from the bakery. "I found a box," turned it over to the sheriff. "A box full of what?" Jack asked from the head of the table, his tone suggesting he'd already decided the answer didn't matter. "Don't know. It was sealed. I didn't open it." Cole laughed. "You didn't open it? Ethan, please tell me you at least looked before you gave it away." "I didn't give it away. I reported what might be stolen property to the proper authorities. Stolen property from 1869, Jack said. Pretty sure the statute of limitations has expired, little brother. Whatever was in there, you could have kept it. Maybe legally, Ethan said, taking his seat. Not morally. Morally, Jack repeated, and there was that familiar edge in his voice that meant a lecture was coming. You know what's immoral, Ethan? Wasting your life on junk nobody wants while sitting on something that could actually be worth something. That's immoral. That's spitting on the opportunities God gives you. Jack, Linda said quietly, a warning in her voice. No, he needs to hear this. Our whole lives, Ethan, you've made these decisions, these noble, pointless decisions that leave you with nothing. You could be helping run this ranch, building equity, securing your future. Instead, you tinker with broken furniture and give away treasure when you find it. When are you going to wake up and realize life doesn't reward being a fool? The table went quiet. Even Cole, usually ready with a quip to lighten the mood, seemed uncomfortable. Ethan set down his fork carefully. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured. I'm not a fool, Jack. I'm just not you. Never have been, never will be. You measure worth in dollars and acres. I measure it differently. That doesn't make either of us wrong. It just makes us different. Different, Jack said. That's what you've been telling yourself your whole life. You're not different, Ethan. You're just afraid. Afraid to try. Afraid to fail. So you hide in that barn and pretend that playing with antiques is a real life. Something in Ethan's chest tightened, but his voice stayed level. Is that what you think? That I'm afraid? What else would you call it? I'd call it knowing what I value. I'd call it being content with who I am, instead of trying to be who someone else thinks I should be. Jack stood up. You know what? I'm done. I'm done watching you waste your potential. I'm done making excuses for you to people who ask why you're not doing anything with your life. You want to play in your barn? Fine. But don't expect me to pretend it matters. He walked out. The front door closed hard behind him. Cole cleared his throat. Well, that was fun. I should go, Ethan said. Don't, Linda said. Jack will cool off. He always does. He worries about you, Ethan. We all do. I know. But maybe he's right. Maybe I should stop coming to these dinners. All I do is disappoint him anyway. You don't disappoint me, Cole said, and there was real sincerity in his voice now. For what it's worth, I think what you did with that box was decent, honest. Not what I'd have done, probably, but that doesn't make it wrong. Ethan looked at his younger brother, surprised. Cole's usual persona was all jokes and easy grins, but underneath that was someone who'd been watching more carefully than Ethan had given him credit for. Thanks, Cole, that means something. The rest of dinner was awkward but civil. Jack didn't come back. Linda tried to keep conversation going, asking about Ethan's current projects, mentioning that the church was looking for someone to restore some old pews. Ethan agreed to take a look, grateful for the olive branch. Driving home, he felt the weight of Jack's words settling on him. Not the anger he was used to his brother's disapproval, but the accusation of being afraid, of hiding. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Was he hiding? Was his workshop a retreat from the world rather than a meaningful engagement with it? He'd always told himself he was preserving history, giving forgotten things value. But maybe Jack was right. Maybe it was all just an elaborate way to avoid taking real risks, building something that mattered beyond his own small sphere. Back at his cottage, he sat on the porch with a beer and watched night settle over the valley. The lights were on in the main house up the hill, and he could see figures moving past the windows. His family going on with their evening. His brother, who'd probably already put their argument aside, focusing on ranch business and quarterly projections. Ethan envied that sometimes. The clarity of Jack's world, where success was measurable and goals were concrete. There was a comfort in that kind of certainty, even if it came with pressure. But no, that wasn't his path and never had been. He couldn't force himself into Jack's mold any more than Jack could understand why Ethan found meaning in restoration and preservation. They were too different, built from different material entirely. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Sheriff called. State Historical Society wants to meet with you. Thursday at 2. Thought you'd want to know." So it was real then. The box was significant enough that official people with official titles wanted to talk about it. Ethan felt a flutter of something in his chest, not quite excitement, but a cousin to it. Vindication, maybe. Proof that his dollar purchase hadn't been as foolish as everyone thought. He texted back, "Thanks for letting me know. I'll be there." Another text came through. "You did the right thing, you know, turning it in." "I know," he typed back. "Doesn't make it easier. The right thing rarely is. That's how you know it's right." Ethan smiled at that. Sarah had a way of cutting through to the truth of things, same as he had a way of seeing value in what others dismissed. They were kindred spirits in that way. Thursday, then. Thursday he'd find out what his $1 wagon had really been hiding all these years, and maybe, just maybe, he'd get to prove to his brothers that seeing value where others saw trash wasn't foolishness after all. It was vision. And sometimes vision paid off in ways that couldn't be measured in quarterly profits or balance sheets. Sometimes it paid off in truth, in history preserved, in mysteries solved. Sometimes that was worth more than money, at least to people like Ethan Miller, who'd never measured worth the same way as everyone else anyway. Thursday came with unseasonable warmth, the kind of early spring day that made you believe winter might actually end someday. Ethan drove into town wearing his good shirt, the one without patches on the elbows, feeling oddly nervous about a meeting he couldn't quite predict. The sheriff's office conference room was small, made smaller by the 4 people already gathered there when Ethan arrived. Sheriff Dawson made introductions. Dr. Patricia Chen from the State Historical Society, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an air of academic authority. Beside her sat Marcus Webb, an attorney representing Union Pacific Railroad's historical interests, and standing by the window, looking uncomfortable in a suit that didn't quite fit, was a man Dawson introduced as Robert Garrett. "Mr. Garrett," Dawson said, "is Thomas Garrett's great-great-grandson. He drove up from Denver when we contacted him about the possible connection to his ancestor." Ethan shook hands with everyone, acutely aware that he was the only person in the room without a title or professional credentials, just a guy who bought junk at auctions and happened to find something that mattered. Dr. Chen got straight to business. "Mr. Miller, before we discuss the contents of the box, I want to thank you for your integrity in reporting this find. Many people wouldn't have. I couldn't keep something that wasn't mine. Which is precisely why we're having this conversation instead of a criminal investigation," the railroad attorney said dryly. "The box has been opened under proper archaeological supervision. What we found inside was remarkable." He nodded to Dr. Chen, who pulled out a folder and spread several photographs on the conference table. Ethan leaned in to look. The images showed the box's contents, uncut sheets of currency, their green ink faded but still legible. Bearer bonds in denominations of $500 and $1,000, and in one corner a leather pouch that had split open to reveal gold coins, their surfaces dulled by time but unmistakably valuable. "The 1,869 Union Pacific Payroll robbery, Dr. Chen said. "This is it. All of it. As far as we can determine. $12,300 in period currency, $7,000 in bonds, and approximately $2,000 in gold coin. In today's money, we're talking about well over $500,000 in face value alone. The numismatic and historical value is considerably higher." Ethan stared at the photographs, feeling something twist in his chest. $500,000. More. He'd held that in his hands, carried it in his truck, and turned it over without knowing what he was giving up. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued. "We found a journal, wrapped in oilcloth and remarkably well preserved. It belonged to Thomas Garrett, and it tells the whole story." She pulled out another photograph. this one showing pages of faded handwriting. Garrett was dying when he wrote this. Probably knew he had months at most from the gunshot wound he'd taken during the robbery. He confesses to the crime, names his accomplices, all of whom apparently died in the escape attempt. He'd managed to get away with the entire payroll, hid it in his freight wagon, but the bullet wound became infected. He knew he was dying and wanted to make his peace with what he'd done. Robert Garrett spoke for the first time, his voice quiet. My family always knew Thomas had died under suspicious circumstances. We had stories passed down about him being involved in something he regretted, but we never knew what. To find out like this, it's hard, but also, in a way, it brings closure. The journal, Dr. Chen said, explains why the wagon was abandoned. Garrett sold it to a rancher named Henrik Larsen, Old Dutch's grandfather, for $20, which he used to buy medicine and try to survive. He planned to come back for the money once he recovered, but he never did. The infection killed him slowly over 3 years, and he died knowing his crime had been for nothing. The room was quiet for a moment, everyone absorbing the weight of that old tragedy. So what happens now? Ethan asked. The railroad attorney answered, the currency and bonds are technically still Union Pacific property, though the company has agreed to donate them to the State Historical Society for preservation and display. The gold coins are more complicated. They may fall under treasure trove law, which means they could belong to the finder, to the state, or to the property owner where they were found. The Larsen estate sold the wagon, Ethan said. I bought it fair and square, which means you have the strongest claim to any treasure trove proceeds, the attorney agreed. But there's another consideration. He gestured to Robert Garrett. Mr. Garrett has expressed interest in claiming his great-grandfather's effects, including potentially the coins, as family property. There's legal precedent for that in cases where the deceased's intent to bequeath can be established, which the journal arguably does. Ethan looked at the younger man, saw the tension in his posture, the careful neutrality of his expression. This man had driven 4 hours from Denver to claim a piece of family history, however dark it might be. What would you do with them? Ethan asked. The coins, if you got them. Robert Garrett met his eyes. Honestly, I'd probably sell them. I've got 3 kids, college tuition coming due, mortgage payments like everyone else. But I'd keep 1 coin, I think, as a reminder that sometimes our ancestors made mistakes, and we have to live with the consequences. And you, Ethan asked the attorney, what would the railroad do? Donate them to the Historical Society along with everything else. Union Pacific's position is that this is a historical matter, not a financial one. Dr. Chen leaned forward. Mr. Miller, you have options here. You could claim the coins as treasure trove, which would likely hold up in court. You could negotiate with Mr. Garrett for a split. Or you could donate them to the society and take a tax deduction. The choice is yours. Ethan looked at the photographs again, at the evidence of a crime committed 150 years ago, at the price one man had paid for his greed. Thomas Garrett had stolen this money and died slowly because of it, never getting to spend $1, never able to enjoy what he'd risked everything for. And then, quite suddenly, something else occurred to him, something the attorney had said, almost in passing. Wait, Ethan said, you mentioned the Larsen estate, Dutch Larsen's estate, the auction where I bought the wagon. That's correct, Dr. Chen said. But Dutch Larsen was Henrik Larsen's grandson, which means... The attorney was already nodding, seeing where Ethan was going, which means technically the wagon never left the Larsen family. It stayed on their property for over a century. And treasure trove found on property typically belongs to the property owner, Dr. Chen said slowly, or, in this case, to the estate. Everyone looked at each other as the implications settled in. The estate was fully liquidated, Sheriff Dawson said. Probate closed last month. Everything was sold, all proceeds distributed to creditors and the state, since Dutch had no heirs. But the wagon was sold as part of that estate, the attorney said, to Mr. Miller for $1. which could be argued to transfer any treasure trove rights along with the physical property. Or, Dr. Chen countered, it could be argued that the treasure was concealed property of the estate that should have been disclosed during probate, which would make it subject to estate recovery. Ethan felt his head starting to spin. So what you're telling me is that nobody actually knows who this belongs to? Welcome to treasure trove law, the attorney said with a thin smile. It's beautifully unclear in cases like this. We could spend the next 3 years in court sorting it out, running up legal fees that would probably exceed the value of the coins and still not have a definitive answer. Or, Dr. Chen said, looking at Ethan with new interest, we could acknowledge that Mr. Miller is the only person in this room who could claim clear legal standing as the finder and purchaser, and let him make the decision about what happens next. That brings us back to where we were, Ethan said. Me choosing what to do with something that maybe isn't mine to choose. Isn't that always the way with treasure? Robert Garrett said quietly. Somebody always has to decide. Might as well be the person who found it and did the right thing in the first place. Ethan looked at each of them in turn, the historian, the lawyer, the descendant, the sheriff, all of them waiting for him to make a choice that would satisfy law and conscience both. And suddenly, he knew what to do. Here's what I propose, Ethan said, and he could hear the certainty in his own voice, the kind that came when you finally saw a path through complicated terrain. Mr. Garrett gets the coins, like I said before, but with one condition. He donates 1 coin to the Historical Society to be displayed with the rest of the payroll. The story isn't complete without all the pieces. Robert Garrett nodded immediately. I can do that. I was planning to keep one anyway. Makes sense for it to be somewhere people can learn from it. The currency and bonds go to the Historical Society for preservation, Ethan continued. But I want something too. Not money. I want the wagon. Dr. Chen frowned slightly. The wagon? It's evidence. It's part of the historical record. I bought it, but I'm willing to donate it to the state on one condition. I get to restore it first, properly. And when it goes on display with the payroll, there's a placard explaining how it was found, not by treasure hunters or archaeologists, but by someone who paid $1 for what everyone else thought was junk. The attorney smiled for the first time. You want credit for the find. I want people to understand that history isn't just in museums and textbooks. It's in the stuff we throw away, the things we overlook. I want someone to see that wagon and realize that maybe they shouldn't be so quick to decide what has value and what doesn't. That's actually quite moving, Dr. Chen said, but the restoration could take months, years, even if done properly. And the exhibit is scheduled to open in 6 months. Then the wagon joins later, or the exhibit opens without it and adds it when it's ready. Either way, I do the work. That's my condition. There was silence while they all considered. Finally, Dr. Chen said, I'll need to consult with the society board, but I think we can make that work. Your reputation as a restorer is actually quite good, Mr. Miller. Sarah Hendricks has mentioned your work several times. And frankly, the human interest angle junk collector finds, historical treasure, would be excellent for public engagement. There's one more thing, Ethan said. When this gets out, and it will get out, my family is going to hear about it. My brothers specifically. They're going to have opinions about my decisions here today. I need you all to understand something. I don't want money from this. I don't want credit beyond that placard. We can, Sheriff Dawson said. In fact, I think that's exactly what should happen. The attorney was making notes. I'll draft an agreement reflecting these terms. Mr. Garrett receives the coins -1, which goes to the Historical Society. Society receives the currency, bonds, and eventually the restored wagon. Mr. Miller receives recognition as the finder and restorer, plus custody of the wagon during the restoration period. Everyone agree? They agreed. Handshakes were exchanged, contact information traded. Robert Garrett pulled Ethan aside as people were gathering their things. I need you to know, he said. What you're doing giving me those coins, my kids are going to go to college because of you. My family gets to turn something shameful into something good. I won't forget that. Just tell the story true, Ethan said. That's all I ask. Driving home, Ethan felt oddly light, like he'd set down a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. The wagon would be his project for the next however long it took. He'd restore it properly, document every step, make it something people could learn from. His brothers were going to lose their minds when they found out, but that was all right. He was used to that. What he wasn't prepared for was finding both his brothers' trucks parked outside his cottage when he got home. Jack and Cole were on his porch, waiting. They didn't look happy. "We need to talk," Jack said as Ethan climbed out of his truck. "About what?" "About the fact that you just gave away a fortune," Cole said. "Again. We heard from Linda, who heard from someone at the sheriff's office. Is it true? You found $50,000 worth of gold coins and just handed them to some stranger?" "It's complicated," Ethan said. "It's insane," Jack said, and his voice had that edge it got when he was trying very hard not to explode. "Ethan, do you have any idea what you could have done with that money? Do you understand what kind of opportunities you just threw away?" "I understand fine. I made a choice based on what I thought was right." "Right," Jack repeated. "You gave away our family's chance at financial security because of some moral principle nobody asked you to have." "Our family?" Ethan said carefully. "Jack, I found that wagon. I bought it with my own money." "How exactly is it our family's anything?" "Because we're family," Jack said, as if it was obvious. "Because when one of us has the chance to improve all our situations, that's what family does. But you'd rather play the noble fool than actually help the people who've supported you your whole life." Something cold settled in Ethan's chest. "Supported me? Is that what you call it? Mocking every decision I make, telling me I'm wasting my life, treating me like I'm a disappointment at every family dinner?" "We've given you a place to live," Jack said, "a stipend every month, access to this property. And this is how you repay us? By making decisions that benefit strangers instead of your own family?" "The stipend," Ethan said slowly, "is part of Dad's will. The cottage is mine as long as I want it. I'm not taking charity, Jack. I'm taking what's legally mine." "Legally," Jack said, "always hiding behind technicalities and principles instead of just doing what's right." "What's right? According to who? You? You think right means keeping money that wasn't mine, that came from a crime, just because I found it? You think that's what Dad would have wanted? Dad would have wanted you to provide for your family, to build something, instead of constantly giving away anything of value you stumble across." "My family," Ethan said, and his voice was very quiet now, "would have supported my decision. My family would have trusted that I knew what I was doing and why. My family wouldn't be standing on my porch demanding explanations for choices that were mine alone to make." "So we're not your family now?" Cole asked, and there was hurt in his voice beneath the anger. "I don't know," Ethan said honestly. "Are you? Because families support each other. They don't just show up when there's money involved." Jack's face flushed red. "That's not fair, and you know it." "Isn't it? When's the last time either of you came by just to visit? When's the last time you asked about my work without mocking it? When's the last time you treated me like someone whose judgment you respected instead of someone whose decisions you have to tolerate?" The silence stretched out. Cole looked away. Jack's jaw worked like he was chewing words he couldn't quite spit out. "That's what I thought," Ethan said. "Look, I appreciate that you're concerned. I do, but my decisions are my own. The coins went to someone who needed them more than I did. The wagon is going to become part of a historical exhibit, and I'm going to restore it because that's what I do. I fix things people think are broken beyond repair." "You're making a mistake," Jack said. "Then it's my mistake to make." "Fine." Jack turned to walk to his truck, then stopped and looked back. "But don't expect me to keep supporting your decisions when they're this ridiculous. You want to throw away opportunities? Do it on your own. Don't expect the family safety net to be there when you finally realize what you've lost." "I never expected it to be there in the first place," Ethan said quietly. He watched his brothers drive away, dust rising behind their vehicles in the late afternoon light. Part of him wanted to call them back, to explain better, to make them understand. But another part, the part that had been growing stronger over the years, knew that some people would never understand, and that was all right. Inside the cottage, he poured himself a whiskey and sat at his small table, looking out the window at his barn. The wagon was out there, waiting, a year's worth of work, maybe more. Long winter nights of careful restoration, of research and planning and patience. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Heard it went well today, proud of you." He smiled and texted back, "Thanks, going to be restoring the wagon for the Historical Society." "That's perfect, you'll do amazing work." Another text, this one from Linda. "Jack came home angry. I don't know the whole story, but I want you to know I think what you did was good. Don't let him make you doubt that." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. Maybe he wasn't alone after all. Maybe family wasn't just blood, but the people who saw you clearly and supported you anyway. He finished his whiskey and walked out to the barn as the sun touched the horizon. The wagon sat there in the dim light, waiting for him to begin. Tomorrow he'd start the real work. Tonight he'd make plans, sketch ideas, think through the process. This was going to be the most important restoration he'd ever done, not because of the money or the historical significance, though both mattered, but because this wagon represented everything he'd been trying to prove his whole life, that discarded things could be valuable, that patience and care could reveal hidden worth, that the things other people overlooked often held the most important stories. He ran his hand along the weathered wood, feeling the grain beneath decades of neglect. "All right," he said to the wagon, to himself, to the ghosts of everyone who'd ever doubted him. "Let's show them what $1 can buy." 6 months passed, in a blur of careful work and quiet satisfaction. Ethan threw himself into the wagon restoration with an intensity that surprised even him. Every morning he was in the barn by dawn, coffee cooling on the workbench while he worked. Every evening he stayed until the light failed and his eyes couldn't focus anymore. The work was painstaking. Each piece of wood had to be evaluated. Was it salvageable or too far gone? The iron bands had to be cleaned of rust without damaging the original material. The bolts, the fittings, everything had to be documented, photographed, restored or replaced as needed. Sarah came by twice a week, helping with the historical research, tracking down period-accurate materials for the parts that couldn't be saved. She brought books about wagon construction, photographs of other Conestoga wagons from museum collections, specifications from the era. "You're doing incredible work," she said one evening, running her hand along a wagon side he'd just finished. The wood glowed with oil and care, the grain brought back to life. "This is museum quality, Ethan." "It has to be," he said. "People need to see what it really was. Not just a pile of junk, but something that mattered. Something that carried people's lives and hopes and, in this case, their crimes." The story had made the local news, then the regional papers, then picked up by a few national outlets. "Local man finds historical treasure in dollar wagon," ran in the Denver Post. The Wyoming Historical Quarterly did a feature. A blogger who specialized in Western history wrote a long piece about the wagon and the robbery, and Ethan's decision to give the coins to Robert Garrett. People started showing up at auctions, looking at him with recognition. "You're the guy who found the payroll wagon, right?" They'd ask about restoration techniques, about how to spot value in old things. Some of them thought he was crazy for giving away the coins. Some thought he was noble. Ethan didn't care much either way. He just kept working. His brothers didn't visit. That first angry confrontation had settled into a cold distance that suited everyone. Apparently, Ethan didn't attend Sunday dinners anymore. Linda texted occasionally, updates about the family, small kindnesses. Cole sent a message once, "Jack's being stubborn. Give him time." But Ethan had given Jack 45 years already. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for his brother to understand him and just accept that he never would. The Historical Society sent Dr. Chen to check on the progress in month 4. She spent 2 hours in the barn, examining every detail, asking questions about his methods. "This is exceptional work," she said finally. "Mr. Miller, have you considered that you might be doing yourself a disservice by calling yourself just a hobbyist? This is professional-level restoration." "It's what I do," Ethan said simply. "It could be what you do for a living. We have restoration contracts available. Artifacts that need this level of care. The pay is well. It's better than monthly stipends, I'd imagine." Ethan looked up from the wheel, spoke he was fitting. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you contract work, if you're interested. No pressure, but you should know that your skills are valuable to people beyond your immediate community." He thought about that after she left. Real work, professional work, doing what he loved. It was tempting, but it was also a leap he wasn't sure he was ready for. By month 5, the wagon was taking shape. No longer a wreck, it was becoming something whole again. Not perfect, he was careful to preserve evidence of its age and history, but restored to a state where you could see what it had been, imagine the hands that had built it and the journey it had made. He was working on the driver's bench one Saturday morning when he heard trucks pull up outside. Multiple trucks. He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans, and walked to the barn door. The whole county seemed to be there. Sarah, of course, Dr. Chen and her team from the Historical Society, Sheriff Dawson, Robert Garrett, who'd driven up from Denver with his whole family, and standing at the back, looking uncertain, were Jack and Cole. "We heard," Sarah said, smiling, "that you were putting the finishing touches on. Thought we'd come see the unveiling." Ethan looked past her at his brothers. Cole gave a small wave. Jack stood with his hands in his pockets, not quite meeting Ethan's eyes. "It's not done yet," Ethan said. "Still needs the final oil treatment, the canvas cover reproduction, some detail work." "Close enough," Dr. Chen said. "We wanted to see, and to talk to you about the exhibit opening. It's scheduled for next month. We need to coordinate transport, installation, and we want you there," Sarah added. "Front and center. This is your story as much as Thomas Garrett's." Ethan looked at the crowd gathered in his barn doorway, at all these people who'd shown up because they cared about what he'd found and what he'd done with it. At his brothers, standing awkward but present. "All right," he said. "Come in. Let me show you what a dollar wagon looks like when someone sees its value." The crowd filed into the barn, spreading out around the wagon that dominated the space. Ethan watched their faces as they took it in, the restored wood gleaming with fresh oil, the iron bands cleaned and preserved, the whole structure stable and true for the first time in over a century. Robert Garrett approached it slowly, almost reverently. His children, 3 teenagers, hung back until he waved them forward. "This is what your great-great-great-grandfather drove," Robert said to them quietly. "This is where he hid the money he stole, where he made the choice that defined our family for 5 generations. It's beautiful," his oldest daughter said, which made Ethan's chest tighten unexpectedly. Dr. Chen was circling the wagon, making notes, nodding to herself. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary, both the original work and your restoration, Mr. Miller. This is going to be the centerpiece of our exhibit." Sarah stood beside Ethan, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You should be proud," she said quietly. "This is important work. It's just a wagon. You and I both know it's not just anything. It's a piece of history brought back to life. It's proof that things have value beyond what people first see. It's everything I've been trying to say my whole life," Ethan finished. "Just never expected anyone to actually listen." Jack and Cole had moved around to look at the driver's bench, at the space where the box had been hidden. Cole ran his hand along the wood, careful not to disturb anything. "This is really something, Ethan," he said. "I mean it. This is real work." Jack didn't say anything, just stood there looking at the wagon with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. Dr. Chen called for everyone's attention. "I want to thank Ethan Miller for allowing us to see this before the exhibit opens. What he's accomplished here is remarkable, not just technically, but ethically. He found something valuable and handled it with integrity at every step. He's turned what could have been a simple treasure hunt into a profound historical preservation. She pulled out a folder, which brings me to something I discussed with the Society Board. Mr. Miller, we'd like to offer you a position as a restoration consultant. Regular contract work, restoration projects on historical artifacts throughout the state. The pay is competitive, and you'd be doing what you're clearly gifted at. Ethan felt the barn go still. Everyone was looking at him now. That's generous of you, he managed. It's not generosity, it's recognition of skill. We need people who understand that preservation is about more than just the object. It's about the story, the history, the care taken to honor what came before. You understand that in your bones. We'd be lucky to have you. Before Ethan could respond, Jack stepped forward. His face was tight, controlled, but his voice shook slightly when he spoke. "Can I say something?" Ethan nodded, bracing himself. "I owe you an apology," Jack said. "Actually, I owe you about 45 years' worth of apologies, but I'll start with the recent ones. I was wrong about the coins. Wrong about this wagon. Wrong about a lot of things." He gestured at the restored wagon. "I've spent my whole life measuring worth in acres and quarterly profits, tangible returns on investment, and I looked at you and saw someone who didn't fit that measure, so I decided you didn't measure up at all. But standing here, looking at this," his voice caught. He cleared his throat, tried again. "You took something everyone else thought was worthless and turned it into something that matters. You found treasure and handled it with more integrity than I've shown in my entire life. You made decisions based on what was right instead of what was profitable, and somehow you ended up with more than I have, despite all my careful planning and investment strategies." "Jack," Ethan started, but his brother held up a hand. "Let me finish. You have work you love, people who respect you, a reputation for honesty that made strangers trust you with historical treasures. And me, I've got a ranch that runs itself and a relationship with my brother that I've spent decades breaking and never once tried to fix." Jack looked directly at Ethan now, and there were tears in his eyes. I'm sorry for making you feel like you had to be someone you're not. I'm sorry for measuring you by my standards instead of recognizing that you have your own. And I'm sorry it took a 150-year-old wagon to make me see what should have been obvious all along. You were right, and I was wrong." The barn was dead silent. Ethan felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been locked tight for as long as he could remember. "I don't need you to be wrong," Ethan said quietly. "I just need you to let me be right in my own way." "I know that now." Jack's voice was rough. "I'm asking if it's too late. If there's any chance we can start over, be brothers instead of whatever we've been." Ethan looked at his brother, at the genuine remorse in his face, at the years of distance between them that had suddenly shrunk to nothing more than the space across a barn floor. "It's not too late," Ethan said. "It's never too late to start seeing value in what you've been overlooking." And when Jack crossed that floor and pulled him into a hug, Ethan hugged back, finally, after all these years. The exhibit opened on a crisp Saturday in October, exactly 11 months after Ethan had bid $1 on a wagon everyone else ignored. The Wyoming State Historical Society had outdone themselves. The main gallery was devoted entirely to the Union Pacific Payroll robbery, with the restored wagon as the centerpiece. Display cases around it held the currency, the bonds, the journal, and one gleaming gold coin, the one Robert Garrett had donated, just as promised. But it was the placard next to the wagon that made Ethan's throat tight when he read it. This Conestoga wagon, built circa 1867, was purchased for $1 at a 2024 estate auction by Ethan Miller of Medicine Bow County. While restoring the wagon, Mr. Miller discovered a lead-lined box containing the complete proceeds of the 1869 Union Pacific Payroll robbery, one of Wyoming's greatest unsolved mysteries. Rather than keep his find, Mr. Miller reported it to authorities and worked with historians to ensure this piece of Wyoming history could be shared with the public. The wagon was painstakingly restored by Mr. Miller over 6 months and donated to the Wyoming State Historical Society. His actions exemplify the highest standards of integrity and remind us that the most valuable discoveries are those we choose to share. Sarah stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. "They got it right," she said softly. "They did," Ethan agreed. The gallery was packed. Local news stations had sent cameras, newspapers had run stories, people from 3 states had driven in for the opening, and standing with Ethan were his brothers, both of them present and for once genuinely interested in what he'd accomplished. "This is really something," Cole said, looking at the wagon with what appeared to be actual awe. "I mean, I saw it in your barn, but seeing it here like this, Ethan, you did something important." Jack hadn't said much since they'd arrived, but he'd stayed close, and that meant something. When Dr. Chen asked Ethan to say a few words to the gathered crowd, Jack was the one who said, "Go on, tell them what it means." Ethan had never been comfortable with public speaking, but he stepped up to the microphone they'd set up and looked at all those faces looking back at him. "I'm not much for speeches," he started, "but I want to tell you why this matters. All my life, I've collected things other people throw away. Old furniture, rusted tools, broken things that everyone else decided weren't worth fixing. My family thought I was wasting my time. Maybe I thought so too sometimes." He glanced at Jack, who nodded encouragement. "But this wagon taught me something. It taught me that value isn't just in what something costs or what it's worth right now. Value is in the story, in the history, in the care we take to preserve what matters. This wagon was worthless to everyone but me. And inside it was hidden one of the most significant historical finds in Wyoming history." He paused, gathering his thoughts. This was about a man named Thomas Garrett, who made a terrible mistake and paid for it with his life. This was about his family 5 generations later, finally getting closure. This was about all of us learning that sometimes the things we dismiss, the things we overlook, hold the most important stories. So when you look at this wagon, I hope you see more than a historical artifact. I hope you see a reminder to look closer, to value things beyond their surface worth, to treat history and each other with the care and respect they deserve. That's what I've tried to do my whole life, and I'm grateful it finally mattered to someone besides me." The applause that followed was warm, genuine. Robert Garrett's family was there, and his oldest daughter had tears on her face. Dr. Chen was beaming. Sarah squeezed his hand, and Jack was looking at him like he was seeing him for the first time. Later, after the formal ceremony ended and the crowd thinned, the Miller brothers stood together in front of the wagon, just the 3 of them, for the first time in years without tension crackling in the air. "I've been thinking," Jack said carefully, "about that job offer from the Historical Society. Are you going to take it?" "I am," Ethan said. "Signed the contract last week." "That's good, really good." Jack paused, then continued, "And I've been thinking about the ranch, about how we run things, how we've always run things." "Jack, you don't have to. Let me finish. I want to hire you. Not for ranch work, but for restoration. The old homestead house, the original barn, all those historical buildings on the property that I've been letting rot. I want you to restore them properly, document them, preserve that history. It'd be contract work, paid fair market rate, if you're interested." Ethan stared at his brother. "You're serious? Dead serious? It's our family history too. Our great-grandfather built those structures. They deserve the same care you gave this wagon, and I want to work with you instead of around you, if that's something you'd consider." Cole was grinning. "I may have suggested it, but it was his idea to actually follow through." "I'd like that," Ethan said. "I'd like that a lot." That evening, Ethan drove home under a sky full of stars, his father's pocket watch on the passenger seat beside him. He'd brought it to the exhibit, shown it to Dr. Chen, told her about his grandfather's 25 years with Union Pacific. That should be in the exhibit too, she'd said. The connection, the family history. Would you consider loaning it to us? He'd thought about it, holding the tarnished silver in his hand, feeling the weight of 3 generations. And then he'd said yes, because that's what you did with stories that mattered, you shared them. Now, pulling up to his cottage with the barn dark and waiting, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in all his 45 years. He felt understood, valued, seen for exactly who he was, instead of measured against who someone thought he should be. Tomorrow he'd start planning the homestead restoration with Jack. Next week he had a contract job with the Historical Society, cataloguing artifacts from a ranch donation. The week after, Sarah had mentioned maybe getting dinner sometime, and he'd said yes to that too. Life was good, different than he'd expected, but good. He'd bought a wagon for $1 and found a fortune, not the kind you could spend, but the kind that changed everything anyway. Sometimes the best treasures were the ones you never knew you were looking for. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, $1 was enough to buy back everything you'd thought you'd lost, including your family, your purpose, and the certainty that seeing value where others saw trash wasn't foolishness after all. It was vision, and vision properly applied was worth more than all the gold in Wyoming.